Well, Governor, thank you for taking the time to sit down for this AP interview. Since we're in Washington, I want to start with 2024. You've made it clear that you were thinking about running for president. Have you made a decision yet?
I've not made a decision yet, but it's even accelerated the decision making after the midterm elections in terms of the interest, in terms of the motivation. The midterm elections made it clear to me that the GOP needs a bold agenda, but also new voices that's articulating what our party stands for, the direction we want to take our country. So very serious about it, but no decision has been made.
Do you have a timeline?
Not a specific timeline, obviously, because we already have President Trump in the race, that accelerates everyone's decision making, and I know that there's many really good candidates that are looking at that, but my next step is to measure the level of financial support. That's important, and so no decisions have been made, but we're still just simply looking at it. But also I want to continue to wherever it is on the national stage to articulate what I believe in, the direction that our country should go, and that messaging is an important part of evaluating where we need to go as a country, but also my steps in 2024.
Is it a matter of days, weeks, months? Kind of what are we looking at here for you to get closer to it?
Well, it should be in the first quarter of next year because, again, we have candidates in there. I expect more candidates to get in. I don't have the highest national profile of everybody that's looking at it, and so, you've got to allow time, if you do decide to do it, to build the base of support that's needed.
What is going to be the deciding factor for you overall on whether to run?
Well, I think there's a couple different factors that are important. One, what's the response to my message, my tone, my leadership, and that's been very, very positive. That's been encouraging, from my Ideas Summit to the response to what we've done in Arkansas to the tone and the direction we need to go to bring our country and party together. And then, of course, it's the level of support and whether you can build the organization, and that's the stage that we're in, as to whether I can be competitive and whether there's the response that's needed to have a winning campaign.
If you do run, you'll likely be one of at least several kind of anti-Trump candidates running at a time that the former president still has a significant amount of support. What's going to make you stand out in what could be a pretty wide lane of alternatives to Trump?
Well, first of all, and everybody thinks, well, if we have, 5, 6, 7 candidates in addition to Donald Trump, then that splits the vote, and it's going to be a repeat of what we saw in 2016. I think it's a totally different climate there. I think the process that we have in the early primary and caucus states winnows the numbers very quickly. So I think it'll be much more methodical this cycle than what we've seen in previous years. And I think that competition is good and it's healthy. You have to have candidates that are tested. You have to have candidates that spend time in the retail world of politics, as well as the policy side, as well as the debate side. And so all of that's important. And I think that when you ask about what's different about my potential candidacy, and I think that remains to be seen. I think my unique record, I think my unique experience, both at the federal level, the international level, the state level. I think it's important to have a governor. Governors lead well. They're experienced in managing and solving problems. And then I think it's the tone. I'm known for having a steady hand in leadership, but also a bold agenda. And I think that's a good combination for a leader of the country.
You're known as a methodical person. You don't really kind of do things on a whim. Kind of talk to me about the preparation on this. So who are you turning to for advice on this? Are there other Republicans, other governors, people you've worked for? Kind of how do you go through a process like this?
Well, of course, whenever I've been in Homeland Security, DEA, I have relationships with people and Congress and governors all across the country. So I touch bases with them. I also check with those that have been major supporters in the Republican arena and measure that response. The evangelical community is critically important, and the concerns that they have, and so it's looking at them and getting their counsel and hearing their concerns, and so all of those are boxes that are important for me to check and to visit with and to get their ideas for the future of the country, but also where I fit into that national message and national effort.
You worked under former President Bush. Is he somebody you've turned to for advice?
I have. I've checked in with former President Bush, and what a great guy, and we had a great visit. It was, and I expect to be talking with him again as well as with others.
Turning to last week's midterm runoff or Senate runoff in Georgia, it was a setback for Republicans after midterms where a lot of the major gains that Republicans were hoping for didn't materialize. What do you think the midterm elections say about where the party is and where it's going?
Well, it says that we got to start winning again. Whenever you look at the elections ever since President Trump got elected, we have not had a winning cycle, and we have not met expectations as well. Now, I think it is important to put the last midterm election in context, that what we saw is that the electorate was not rejecting Republican ideas and values and solutions. They were rejecting specific candidates. And that's important to remember. And while we didn't have a national red wave, we did have red waves in many different areas of the country, including Arkansas, in which we picked up seats at really every level. You look at Iowa, you had an Iowa Attorney General, Republican, and Iowa Treasurer, Republican, that defeated incumbents, longtime Democrat incumbents. And so there was a red wave in Iowa. And then you look at New York, Lee Zeldin doing so well in New York. That is encouraging that, the solutions that we offer to crime, the solutions we bring to border security, that's what Americans are looking for. It's just that we're very disappointed that because of poor candidates, poor messaging, looking back instead of looking forward, we didn't do as well as we should have in the midterm election.
You talked about Trump. Wanted to see what you thought about his statement recently, where he had called for terminating parts of the Constitution to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
Well, I've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution for 3 different major offices, and so I believe in the Constitution. I've sworn to uphold the Constitution, and I intend to continue to do that. I'm a rule of law guy. That's the Republican principles. It's our country's principles. And I yearn for the day that potential candidates and public leaders on the Republican side do not have to respond to every latest rumination of the former president. That to me was so out of line and out of step with America that it almost does not deserve a response, but it's serious enough that you want to make it perfectly clear that we follow the Constitution, we'll continue to do so. It's the framework of our democracy.
You're kind of a low key person. The description I use a lot of times is that you do the press conferences with the easels with charts and graphs, and you're going to be running against some pretty high profile people if you do run. Obviously, President Trump, and there's some other higher profile people who may be running. How do you compete with that? Kind of given your background, your style, are you gonna have to change your style?
Well, no. First of all, you've got to be authentic. You've got to be yourself. You've got to be true to your own values and who you are. So I'll be the same, but I'll also be reminding them of the tough things that I've done in life, from having to address terrorists and prosecuting terrorists and white supremacists, to taking tough stands whenever I was in Congress, or whether I'm in Homeland Security and handling some of the toughest jobs in America. And then as governor, whenever you look at bold leadership, my goodness, lowering our taxes in Arkansas by historic margins, reducing our state employees by over 3,000 workers, 14% reduction in state employment even though we increase services. Whenever you look at the fact that we have led the nation in computer science education and setting an example in education and reading, these are bold initiatives that I think sell well and illustrate the fact that you can be a problem solver. Governors do this every day, and you hold us accountable, and that to me is what our country is looking for.
You spoke at the Reagan Library recently, and you talked about some of that background, about your history as a federal prosecutor in Arkansas in the 1980s, prosecuting white supremacists, and you contrasted that with former President Trump, breaking bread with a white nationalist at Mar-a-Lago. But there are still some Republicans who have yet to directly criticize the former president over that meeting. Is that fear of confronting the former president on things even like this going to be a problem for the party?
Well, it illustrates the importance of having leaders and new voices such as myself and a growing number of others that say exactly what needs to be said, that speaks the truth, and not worried about whether you're satisfying somebody down in Mar-a-Lago or not. That's the kind of voices that we need, strong voices that are speaking to principle, to our Constitution, to our values, that bring our country more together and unite our party as well. And it's important that, we recognize that during the Trump administration, many good things were done. He had a good Republican team. They were able to accomplish tax cuts. They're able to accomplish improved relations in the Middle East, improved border security. So you've got to acknowledge that, but you have to look to the future. And whenever you look at the future, it's a voice that does not create chaos, but that solves problems and fights for the serious issues that face everyday Americans. And they're not looking to, what's the next storyline. They're looking to the next solution, and they're looking to the next better path for the next generation. And so that's the voice we need, and that's why, for the reason you said, my voice is important as well.
If Trump wins the nomination, do you think he could beat Biden?
Well, anything can happen, but that's really the worst scenario. That's almost the scenario that Biden wishes for. That's probably how he got elected the first time. It became, a binary choice for the American people between the challenges that we saw in the Trump presidency, particularly the closing days, versus Biden, who he made it that choice. And so that's not a choice we want again. You look at the favorability ratings of President Biden is very, very low for a president. And so there's not confidence in the direction he takes America. So let's have a good option that can define the terms of the debate better, that gives the American people a better choice, that represents the Republican path to better border security, solving the problems of crime, and steadiness when it comes to our foreign policy that stands for the strength of America and the goodness of America at the same time.
You've said before you're not going to support Trump. Does that include if he's the nominee? Are you not going to support him?
We're not going to address that. I mean, I've said very clearly I think the Republican Party ought to go a different direction. I'm going to work hard to make sure there's the right choices in there and that we make the right selection. And so I think it's time to move on, and I think there's many that will join in that effort.
Going back to his statement on wanting to terminate parts of the Constitution, does rhetoric like that hurt the party and its chances?
Well, it hurts our country. Any leader, former president that says suspend the Constitution is tearing at the fabric of our democracy. And so we want to make sure that the people know that it's Republicans that support the rule of law, That's why we want to see the law enforced when it comes to violence in our cities. We want to see the law enforced when it comes to our border security. We want respect for our immigration laws. And that's what holds our country together, but distinguishes us from other countries across the globe that don't follow the rule of law. And so we just need many voices, and there are out there. We just need to be bold in that voice, that this is what the Republican Party stands for, and I think America gets that, and they'll follow that leadership.
You're in the final weeks of your time in office. After 8 years as Arkansas governor, what are you pointing to as your biggest accomplishments?
Well, you look at areas that we have done great things, but it was not just because they happened on my watch, but because they wouldn't have happened without my leadership. And so when you look at leadership, it is the tax cuts that we had that spurred our economy on, that allowed us to create 120,000 more jobs than we had when I became governor. It is the fact that we had a very bold initiative early on, said we need to have computer science in every high school. We've gone from 1,100 students to over 23,000 students taking computer science. Whenever you look at the fact that we have 3,000 fewer employees means that we've made government more efficient, and we've provided services. It continued the expansion of Medicaid services for the working poor. All of those are accomplishments, and it took leadership to get those things done. Many of those would not have happened without my leadership. And then, of course, the one thing you don't bargain for, and that is the pandemic that came along. And the fact that we kept our schools open, that we kept our businesses open, we resisted the national pressure to shelter in place, made a big difference for Arkansas, and that leadership, I think, clearly was manifested during the pandemic as well.
Anything you look at as your biggest disappointments?
You know, I'm really honored to be governor for 8 years, and there's not any disappointments. There's some things that I'm sure we could have done better. There's a few do-overs that you'd like to have, but you make the best judgment that you can at the time, and get all the facts that you can, and you live with those, and you go on, and I've done that. And I've also explained it, been very transparent, and as necessary, defended those positions. And if you look at my leadership as governor, I've had an open relationship with the media. I've not been hesitant to go out and have town hall meetings on controversial topics because I want to hear from people, but also they need to hear from me. And so that relationship with the voters is very important. And so regrets are few, and the reward is very great for the last 8 years.
Do you have one do-over, if you can just name one that you'd like?
Well, you know, of course, early on, I made a couple trips to China, bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and we had some success there, but what we couldn't anticipate was the trade wars and China going to more autocratic and concentration of powers that destroyed that relationship and that possibility of really bringing those kind of manufacturing facilities back. And so, sure, in hindsight, I wish I would have spent more time in South Korea, Japan, and India. But those would have been, I think, more productive visits. So, that would be a good do-over. But that's something you couldn't anticipate at that time, and but there's so many different opportunities to bring manufacturing back to the United States. We've been successful in it, but I probably could have spent some of my time in my foreign trips in more preferred locations.
You, in recent years, have cautioned Republicans about needing to show restraint on some culture wars issues. And I'm thinking in particular about when you vetoed the ban on gender-affirming care for minors last year. But you've advocated for and championed some culture wars issues. You've signed a number of abortion bans and restrictions since taking office. How do you define that restraint or that path on it?
Well, the key thing is for Republicans and conservatives is to think about it. Let's not instinctively say, well, let's use the power of government to accomplish our social agenda or our cultural agenda. Our first response is, Let's strengthen the home. Let's strengthen the families and the communities and our churches and synagogues. Let's strengthen those because that's the greatest impact on our culture. And there's a limited amount that government can or should do. But whenever it becomes, for example, to the issues of saving unborn children, those are relevant, important areas that the government should be able to regulate and to use its power to save lives. Whenever it comes to transgender reassignment surgeries, let's use the power to make sure that those decisions aren't made by government. Make sure that's not made whenever they're minors. But it's a little bit different when you're just simply interfering with the decision of a parent, child, and a doctor in terms of routine medical care. And so these are gray areas, but let's talk about it. Let's say, is this where we want to use the power of government to accomplish certain objectives, or whether we ought to restrain government? And I think that's historically where the Republican Party has been.
There have been other states and other governors that have pursued similar bans on gender-affirming care since Arkansas or have pursued it. Do you think those other states need to show the same restraint when it comes to that issue in particular?
Well, every state can make its own decision. I simply looked at that bill as one of the most extreme in the country. I question its constitutionality. I would have signed it if it had been a simple prohibition on reassignment surgeries. I would have signed that bill. But it went way too far, much beyond that. It's currently being litigated in court. Every state, again, makes its own decisions. But I made the best decision I could based upon what I saw the Constitution and what I saw as a bill that went too far.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, you held regular, daily news briefings that were televised around the state. You did town halls to address misinformation about the virus, about the vaccine. Kind of given that experience, what do you think about Twitter is no longer enforcing its COVID-19 misinformation policy? Is that going to make it more difficult for public health officials to deal with combating COVID and other health issues?
Well, first, it's very troubling to see the disclosures of Twitter and how Twitter's rules were really informed and manipulated by the government, and it appeared that they were stifling a fair debate on the issues. So I'm for some congressional hearings on that. That's a challenging area for us to make sure that our social media and these large platforms that are in essence the public square, but you don't want government controlling them, but you want the private sector to manage them appropriately. So it is troubling. But in terms of how we handled it, I think it's a perfect example of where the best information you want to give to your constituents, those that are challenged with COVID. I brought in the medical community, the experts that we had. We had discussions about that. We provided them the information, and ultimately, those are decisions that individuals make. But we wanted to get that information out there, and that's why we had the town hall meetings that sometimes got a little exciting.
If you do run, you're going to be the third Arkansas governor in the past 30 years to run for president. Bill Clinton, obviously, former Governor Mike Huckabee. Arkansas is a small state. It's not as high profile as bigger population areas. Why does it produce these national figures like this? Well,
it's the same reason that we produce great giants in industry like Sam Walton, Don Tyson, J.B. Hunt, Charles Murphy in oil exploration. There's something about Arkansas that we produce, and we become larger than simply our state and the small geographic area that we have. In a political way, I can't speak for the past, but it is a little bit of a challenge whenever you see large media markets and governors in those that get extraordinary amount of coverage, and you don't get the same whenever you are in a smaller state. But That's okay. We have an incredibly wonderful state that produces giants in industry and giants in the political world as well. And I think it's a recognition that we see the world differently, and we want to impact it. And that's what motivates me to speak out and to develop a national profile that I hope will be helpful for our country.
Going back to the midterm election real quick, looking at the results that we saw from the election, do you think Republicans as a whole need to rethink their approach to early voting and by-mail voting, also their rhetoric surrounding it too?
There's two principles that Republicans should follow whenever it comes to voting. First of all, we want more people to vote versus fewer people to vote. And secondly, we want integrity in the ballot box. That's why we have voter ID in Arkansas. That's why we make sure that when you have early voting, you can assure that one person votes and there's an identity for that person and there's integrity in that ballot. So we've got to have that message. Let's don't try to diminish, for example, early voting. We need to accept that. It's very convenient, but we just need to make sure that it is honestly done and that it is controlled in a way that doesn't allow for fraud or abuses in there. And so it's a state-by-state process and rule, but yeah, we've got to live with early voting. That's part of our future. It's convenient. It brings more people out. I think there should be a limit. I mean, we got 2 weeks in Arkansas for early voting, and I think whenever you get to 30 days or more, it makes it a really long voting season. We also have to streamline the counting to make sure that we get those returns in more timely and that the election doesn't extend 30 days beyond the election date. So there's some reforms that can be done state by state, some best practices there. But yes, I think in Georgia, we pushed back against early voting, and there were some abuses there. So we've got to concentrate more on the integrity of the ballot versus simply opposing early voting.
You know, you're a former congressman. As someone who served in the U.S. House, are you worried about Republicans being unable to unite behind a candidate for Speaker right now?
I think it's very important that we unite, close the ranks, elect a Speaker. Kevin McCarthy has earned the right to be Speaker. I think he's got the coalition and support for it. You've got some holdouts. They need to go ahead and get him elected Speaker. In terms of the message to the country, we have a great opportunity, and we're sort of weakening our success whenever we won control of the House. Let's take advantage of that. Let's get our leadership in place, and let's set the agenda for next year. A lot of it will be defense, but what we can do in our hearings, but also what we can do in border security, what we can do in increasing energy production in our country. That's the message we need to have, and we need to have our leadership in place to get that done.
One last question. Next month you're going to be leaving office. Sarah Huckabee Sanders will be the next governor of Arkansas. Kind of preparing for that, what kind of advice have you given her about becoming governor?
You know, I haven't given her any advice. I've been there available for answering questions, helping in the transition. We have a great relationship. But I love her agenda, which is to increase literacy, the reading program in the schools, to focus on the issues of crime and public safety. So hats off to her on that agenda. I think she's doing a great job in the transition, putting her team in place, and I'm there to back her up and support it. And but she's got plenty of advice, but she's also got her own great instincts.
All right. Well, Governor, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us for the AP interview.
Thank you, Andrew.